Okay, so today I'm going to talk about cultural evolution in structured populations. So we've been hearing a lot about how cultural evolutionary dynamics can be complex. And the models, kind of like the ones that Arne was talking about and the ones that I've been doing in the course of my career, show that these complex dynamics can exist even in unstructured populations, but we know that humans in particular have structured populations. We're geographically structured, we're more likely to interact with people who are nearby, and we also have kind of other types of social network structure. So some interactions are very likely and some are very rare, and these have to do with things like kinship and proximity and other ways that we assort ourselves. So I'm going to talk about two projects that I've been working on. One is a theoretical model that thinks about how do cultural transmission norms evolve on a social network, and then an empirical project asking what cultural traits might correlate with changing cultural transmission norms. And so the model is work with Juana Karja, who's starting a faculty job at Carnegie Mellon. If you're looking for somewhere to work, she's wonderful. And we have adapted this model to think that she used first to think about kind of genetic evolution, to think about cultural evolution and along a social network. So we have this fitness landscape where environment changes over time. So we have a periodically changing selection pressure. And so we have two traits, big A and little a. And little a is different from big A in that it can take two different forms. There's cultural plasticity here. So in the environment one, the fitness here is on the y-axis. So big A has the highest fitness in environment one, and then when the environment switches, then the little a has higher fitness and big A has lower fitness. And then little a can take these two different forms, but the mean fitness of little a always equals the fitness of big A. And so we're not seeing systematically that one is more fit than the other, but we have this pattern of cultural variability. And so as an example to kind of root this model in something that we can think about in humans, big A could be gathering food from the environment or hunting a certain type of game, and we'll think about it, say it's gathering. And then little a can be hunting, but individuals specialize. And so all little a individuals hunt, but the light orange ones might hunt small game and the big orange ones might hunt big game. And so you can envision a situation where if the environment fluctuates or if individuals migrate to a new environment and that causes the fluctuation, that it would be more advantageous to gather in some environments or in some contexts, and then more advantageous to hunt in other contexts. And it's important with culture, I think, also to think about the fact that these environmental shifts could be culturally mediated, that you can overhunt or overgather and make the other one more fit. So in terms of the norm here, big A individuals have a norm of pure vertical transmission. So you observe the food getting strategy of your parent and you imitate that strategy. Whereas little a individuals have a different norm. They have vertical transmission with probability P, and then with probability 1 minus P, they look across their connections on the network and they find the individual that's most fit and imitate that individual. And so with some probability 1 minus P, these little a individuals are sampling from the social network, and if this food strategy is better, they'll adopt that one. And so in other words, little a is a partly heritable or plastic cultural norm with cultural memory P. And so we do a Moran type model where we have one little a individual in a population of big A, so there's a vertical transmission norm of your food getting strategy, and then we introduce one individual with this plastic norm, and then there's a death birth process where the probability of reproducing is proportional to your fitness. And then little a individuals either learn vertically or sample from their neighbors, and big A individuals always learn vertically. And so we track the spread of the little a individuals in the population and see with what probability do they take over. And so the main question that we're asking here about social networks is, what is the effect of the network structure on this process? And so we here have a schematic of social networks where the mean degree, so the mean number of connections that individuals have is constant, but the standard deviation increases. So from the left, we have everyone is on average connected to the same number of people, and then as that standard deviation increases, we have nodes that have a lot of connections and then a lot of nodes with very few connections. And so this is the distinction I'm going to make between mean and standard deviation of the degree of the network. So the plastic norm, the ability to look around your connections and imitate the more fit option, is more likely to spread on networks that are more interconnected. And I think this is intuitive, that the more people you have to sample, the better chance you have of picking up a more fit form of the allele. And so it makes sense, I think, that as the connectivity increases on a network, we find cultural plasticity and the norm of sampling other individuals in the population to be more adaptive. But I want to point out that as the phenotypic memory increases, we see kind of a non-monotonic relationship here, where the mean node node degree is shown in color, and the probability of fixations on the y-axis, and you can see that the peak, the most likely situation where all these lines fix, is when the phenotypic memory is somewhere in the vicinity of 0.8, and so even though there's plasticity, it seems like it's a little bit of a bed hedging strategy, where you have most people in this situation where the network induces the greatest fixation are still imitating from their parents. About 80% of the time they're imitating from their parents, but then 20% of the time they're looking around and finding another strategy. So cultural memory is still quite high in the situation that leads to the greatest fixation. I think that makes sense as well, because you can imagine that if you are learning right after you're born in this situation, the fact that your parent reproduced means that they're pretty well adapted to the environment, and so they probably have a decent strategy at the time. And so, but if the environment is going to change at some point in the near future, it's good if some individuals in the population have a different strategy. We also observed that low standard deviation in degree increases the fixation. So the networks that were less that were more interconnected smoothly and less kind of disproportionately, some individuals have the most connections and others have very few. It was the ones on the left side of this gradient that showed the highest probability of fixation in this cultural plasticity trait. And this, I think, has to do with network dynamics, that if we think a lot about, if you read up in the network literature, it's common to think about these super connected nodes and the individuals that can really disseminate information very quickly. But if we introduce an allele on this network, it's very likely to hit on a node that has very few connections. And so if randomly a cultural trait appears in the population, it's somewhat unlikely to be to really hit on a super connected node. It's much more likely to be on a node that only has a few connections, and then that individual doesn't have a very big space in which to sample the population, and so the trait does not do very well. So the phenotypically plastic norm allows adaptation to the environment, but this is more beneficial when we have slower environmental change. So if the environmental change is too rapid, then the information that you gain from looking around and finding the most fit individual is not as relevant as it would be if the environment changed a little bit more slowly. And so we see this is the same kind of intuition that we have with vertical transmission. And as we find slow environmental change, you can see the y-axes on these plots are different. The higher probability of fixation occurs when there's slower environmental change, and also as the standard deviation degree is lower here. So the well-mixed population has the highest probability of fixation for a culturally plastic norm, and this, I think, is an extension of all of the different dynamics we've been talking about, that if you can observe everyone in the population, you should just pick the most fit person and imitate that person. And so the environmental rate of change, which is measured in number of time steps between changes, also shows that as the environment changes less frequently, that you have a higher probability that the cultural plasticity will fix. So observing your peers instead of learning from a parent, having that norm of looking around and finding someone who seems like they are doing really well in the environment and copying that person is more adaptive when the network is more even and when the environment changes more slowly. And we also observed that too much cultural memory is less adaptive, so there isn't this bed hedging phenomenon that comes when you get too close to p=1. And so in that situation, if the environment changes, the lineage is stuck with a worse phenotype, and so having having at least a little bit of sampling is beneficial. So population structure, in this case on a social network, can foster or hinder changes in cultural transmission norms depending on the selection pressures. And so the next facet of this is to think about in real populations, when are cultural norms most likely to shift? And so I've collaborated with an undergrad in my lab, Alex, and a grad student, Kate, to think about an empirical analysis of what types of cultural traits can change these large-scale cultural norms. And so we're using an example of matrilineal kinship as something that is kind of, we can conceive of this norm, everyone defines their kinship in a certain way. How would something as broad scale as that change, and how fast can it change? So if we look at, this is dplace, which is a digitized version of the Ethnographic Atlas and other ethnographic resources, we can see that there is a diversity of kinship systems around the world. So we have patrilineal in red, duolateral in blue, matrilineal in green, bilateral in yellow. And so matriliny, the definition of your kin group being through the matrilineal line, through your mother, is pretty rare, about 10% of populations, but it's widespread. It's not located in clustered in one certain place. And the way that we're thinking about this is, just so that we're all on the same page, is that if we have males in squares and females in circles here, the offspring of a couple trace their kinship to their mother. And so all of the offspring of the initial green and purple pair will be in the green kinship group. And so if the if this woman's son marries an orange individual, those offspring will be in the orange kinship group. And so this has created a situation that some anthropologists call the matrilineal puzzle, in which a man in this system, his biological children are not in his kinship group. So if he's going to invest resources in his kin group, kind of transmit any inheritance to the next generation of his kin, those are his sister's children and not his own. And so this is sometimes called the matrilineal puzzle, and there's a lot of debate over, the extent to which it exists and the extent to which it affects evolution. But what it's led to a lot of literature around kind of the instability of matrilineal transmission. So matrilineal transmission in the literature is often characterized as unstable in general, because it's thought that if men have a lot of resources to invest, they're going to subvert the system, invest them in their biological children and not in their kin group. And so that's a separate set of debates. But in terms of for the purposes of thinking about this cultural norm and when it shifts, it's a really interesting one, because there's a lot of hypotheses in the literature about what would lead to shifting cultural norms in this trait. So do certain cultural traits affect the evolution of matrilineal kinship norms? So we collected hypotheses from the literature. This is a subset of them. And I'll focus on a couple of them. The top one says, historically, matrilineal descent groups have probably developed independently on the basis of prior matrilocality. So female-based residence patterns are setting the stage for matrilineal kinship. The matrilineal puzzle is framed as the rule of exogamous marriage is difficult to reconcile with matrilineal. Matrilineal is incompatible with a focus on the nuclear family. Matrilineal is incompatible with economic differentiation, with inequality, so power, property, and prestige. It's incompatible with plows, domesticated animals, cattle domestication, and this is called the cow is the enemy of matrilineal. And then in some island populations, people have said that the fish is the friend of matrilineal, that reef density promotes matrilineal. Yes, 5. Okay, good. So this question that this idea that the cow is the enemy of matrilineal has been studied in Bantu populations by Holden and Mace, and the idea of using a phylogenetically controlled analysis is really important here. So if we say that a lot of matrilineal populations don't have cows and a lot of patrilineal populations do have cows, if we thought about the relationships between those groups, we could we could be kind of finding a pattern where an evolutionary pattern doesn't actually exist. So if there was one, cattle domestication event and one transition to patriliny, then we could find, imagine a correlation where we actually only have one evolutionary event. But if we looked across the phylogeny and found that every time there's been many transitions to cattle domestication and also many independent transitions to patriliny, then we can establish a pattern in which there's correlated evolution between these two traits. And so we gathered genetic and ethnographic data to build built a global phylogeny so that we could study this on the worldwide scale. And then we did correlated evolution tests and ancestral stage reconstructions to try to figure out to what extent were all of these hypotheses actually kind of present in the worldwide literature. And so the previous analysis that I mentioned was really interesting, but it is restricted to a single language family because of the need for a phylogeny. And so, but the idea was that within the Bantu populations that Holden and Mace had information for, you could imagine that matriliny and cattle could be independently evolving. So the rate of gain and loss of matriliny is independent from the rate of gain and loss of cattle. But what they found was evidence for correlated evolution. And so in this sense, the combination of these traits matters. So if you have matriliny, it matters whether or not you have cattle to how fast you transition to patriliny. And so with no cattle, matriliny kind of goes back and forth to patriliny at some low rate. But if there's a transition to cattle and you're in this combination of states, this is unstable, and you might lose the cattle, but it's pretty likely that you'll lose matriliny. So the gain of cattle domestication destabilizes matriliny and causes more rapid evolutionary transitions. And so they established this directionality that the gain or loss of cattle could instigate matrilineal instability. So to think about this on the worldwide scale and also to test other types of traits, we needed a worldwide tree, and we needed a lot of binary cultural categories. And so we went back to dplace, downloaded the whole data set, and found, so what we wanted to do now is say how many of these can we put on the same phylogeny. So we found genetic data for 165 of these societies. We downloaded all of the cultural categories and then binarized them so we could use them in this analysis. So we have 126 binary traits that we tested. And then we used, we need to build the global phylogeny. So we used both the genetic and linguistic data to inform this. So we have, we took a super tree, which is a agglomeration of many, many trees, and added, that only had 2 matrilineal populations in it, so we added a lot of data to it. 12 linguistic trees, our 165 mitochondrial genomes, to try to add more resolution, more matrilineal populations. And so we got a tree at the end with 16 matrilineal populations representing basically all independent transitions. And so then we can map back onto this tree all of our traits. And so we do an ancestral character estimation, which basically for this it's pretty boring because it's given the distribution of our data, really not likely at all that the ancestral population was matrilineal, but for some of the traits, it's more likely that they're ancestral. And then we take each of the 126 traits, map it onto the tree as well, and then test for correlated evolution. And so if we consider the quote that historically matrilineal descent groups have probably developed independently on the basis of prior matrilocality, we find significant evidence for correlated evolution between matrilocality and matrilineal. So it seems that that the combination of matrilineal kinship with no matrilocal residence is pretty unstable, and there's high rates of transition. You either lose matrilineal or gain matrilocal residence. And then the idea that matrilineal is incompatible with inequality, such as power, property, and prestige. This was one of our significant results in this domain. So matrilineal kinship is less stable than non-matrilineal kinship, but the increased rate of evolution happens when slavery is added. So if we have the inequality brought on by slavery, there's a faster rate of loss of matrilineal. And then cows and also plows, which are the enemy of matrilocal residence, at least, and to a lesser extent matrilineal transmission as well. So when you have no large domestic animals or no intensive agriculture, matrilocality can be gained and lost at some rate. But once you add large domestic animals or plow agriculture, you basically never gain matriliny. And so it's destabilized in that sense. So for both of these situations in the model and in the data analysis, we find that cultural context is important. So the network structure can alter the spread of cultural norms in a society, and also several cultural traits are correlated with shifting norms of matrilineal kinship and residence. And some of the hypotheses we found support for, some of them we didn't. But it's kind of taking this worldwide approach of both bridging data and theory to address the shifting cultural norms. So thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for listening. And to my collaborators and funding sources, I'll take any questions you have. Thanks.
It's time for a few questions. Yeah.
Thanks. So just a quick question about the Bayes trade approach.
Uh-huh.
So I guess so that's an approach that's imported from thinking about genetic evolution.
Exactly.
And in the model, there's not any opportunity for powerful biased horizontal transmission. And I take it as an empirical fact that human culture has powerful biased horizontal transmission. So just to give you an example, if you took believes in Jesus as a cultural trait, in Europe, you would track it back and predict that the Indo-European root were all believers in Jesus 6,000 years ago.
That's right.
And you can do that again and again. I can reel off lots of examples. So isn't the entire enterprise a concern, this whole taking this tool from genetic evolution?
I think so, but I think that it at least gives us somewhere to start. And so I think it would be really interesting to try to modify the assumptions of the model for sure. And to some extent, I don't know if I'm trying to think about if it's better to do it on a linguistic tree, and I don't think that necessarily is, but you at least have kind of fewer assumptions about how deep things go. And so we did do the same analysis on 3 different linguistic trees as well, to have kind of smaller subsets with less assumptions about what happens in the deeper times. But yeah, I'd love to talk more about what you think, how you think we could account for it.
The linguistic trees you're using are actually built out of the most hyper-conserved features of language.
Yes.
So that's one of the problems I have with this whole enterprise, and this is widely used, so it's a general concern, is that it then takes these cultural traits like cows and kinship systems to be like the most hyper-conserved features of language.
Yeah. So I think it's worth thinking about, because I've also made, we can make linguistic trees out of other types of things, or we could think about kind of the ones that allow for horizontal transmission and try to think about it like that. So we should talk more about it.
Any other question? I have a quick one myself.
Cool.
What happens if your networks have a real structure in terms of communities?
So if there's clusters, kind of, I think then they mostly act like the ones that have high standard deviation and degree. So it locally permits things to spread, but it doesn't reach fixation very, very often. So things kind of get trapped, I think.
Okay. Any other question? Yeah, quick one.
I think I missed the hypothesis on the relationship between matrilineal kinship and slavery. What was the idea behind that?
The idea was that the metrics we have, that was the one that had, I think, the highest significance, but the metrics we have of inequality in various ways. So the hypothesis was that economic or other types of inequality in a population would destabilize matriliny. And so the okay, so the populations in the ethnographic atlas that had slavery,
Like historical their own slavery.
Yes, that's right, yeah, cool. Okay, thank you so much.